Good morning, Charlotte.
Good morning, Rabbi. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good, I think. Who knows anymore?
Yeah. We don't really see you. All we see is the ceiling at the moment.
Oh, okay. Here I am.
Oh, that is much better.
Much better
Nothing
than
against your ceiling, but I'm much happier looking at
seeing a
you.
person. Seeing a person, right?
Yeah.
I was looking at this Bishala, however you pronounce it.
Bishalach.
Very, very lengthy portion. How do
It
they?
is.
Who figures out how long?
The
How long?
partial. Yeah. The
and
partial.
who's
Yeah.
the people who read? Some portions are like the fourth Aliyah say is very long. The fifth one is very short. Who figures that out?
The partiot were actually set up back in rabbinic time. So, about
who knows? Huh?
yeah. So somewhere, they're already pretty much set. They were probably finally set during the period of the Babylonian Talmud, from so by the 6th century.
Nobody wants to change it, make it more even? Or is that
No.
a stupid question?
Well, it's not a stupid question, but it's not necessarily marked to be even. It's generally they try and group sections together. Again, there are, even though there's no punctuation in the Torah, there are separations between books, separations between sections. So they're really going by a very ancient system. And again, the aliyot are more or less divided by the content. And there are also certain rules they try and follow. So, you try not to end an aliyah on a negative comment.
It's much better that way.
Yeah.
For anything to be positive, if you can.
Occasionally, it's like it ends and starts in the middle of a sentence. Occasionally, not that often.
Well, actually, as Yehudi has mentioned many times, the chapters and sentences, that's a much later introduction. That's from the Middle Ages. We had the division of the text was by the trope. That was the early punctuation. And, so sometimes it looks like we're starting in the middle of a parak, in the middle of a chapter, or in the middle of a verse, but that's not necessarily so. Because, even the punctuation that we put in the Torah, is punctuation based on later history, later languages. Ancient biblical Hebrew didn't necessarily have the same concepts. They had concepts of stops and pauses, and certainly there was a grammar, but it wasn't necessarily totally equivalent to what we have as periods and commas and semicolons and colons. And that was true even when the Christians added the chapter and verse. And then there are also some subtle differences in how the verses are numbered in different editions. So, sometimes you'll read a commentary and they'll say, this is, I don't know, 1 Kings 12:5, and then they'll say, but in this version, 12:6, or something like that. Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to see everyone. I'm also very happy that my computer is working and my internet is working. So hopefully this will continue. So I'll start.
Last week at this time, we had, at least in my area, all the Verizon BIOS lines
Yes.
down. So
Yeah, so it was a lot of people even were able to make it, and even had, I don't know, my computer been working, which it really was, it would not have many of us, just the internet was down all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay, let me sorry, I just want to increase the size. Yeah, there we go. That should be good. Okay. Let me get to the top. So we're going to take a look at the story of Amalek. Tomorrow morning in our discussion, we'll discuss other elements. And of course, this is an incredibly full parasha. We have the Israelites leaving Egypt, and God directs them in such a way that it looks like they're lost in the desert. And that's certainly what Paro thinks. And he chases after them with his army. And they catch up. The Israelites are petrified. God, of course, sends a cloud to block between the pursuing Egyptians and the Israelites. And as the Israelites are crying out to God, Moses said, just wait. God says, what are you yelling about? Just speak to the Israelites and go. And so Moses stretches out his arms, and God causes the wind to, as we know the story, to split the sea, and the Israelites walk across. And then as the Egyptians pursue them, they are drowned in the sea. The Hebrew says, Lo nishar behem ad echad. Not even one remained, but the Midrash reads, Lo nishar behem eid echad. There only remained one witness. And of course, in Cecil B. DeMille's Spectacular, that one witness, following the Midrash, is Paro. He sees his army destroyed. The Israelites, have escaped from Egypt. They celebrate. They sing the song at the sea. Then they start fetching. There's no water. There's no food. And God, of course, responds to them. And after a few incidents of that, they are attacked by Amalek. So a longer description in the book of Deuteronomy. And there are a number of interesting things and difficult elements of this whole discussion of Amalek and what Amalek means, not only within the biblical text, and I should say not just within the Torah text, but within the biblical text, and then what it means in subsequent Jewish tradition. Actually, let's quickly look at the story. I apologize. I didn't put up this one text, which I will do. Give me 1 second. Okay. I will share this text with you in 1 moment. Sorry, I'm just getting it in place. The biblical text, that is. Okay. Here we go. Now let me make sure that I am sharing this as well. Okay, this should work. It should work. Can you see that now?
Yes.
A different text? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the story of Amalek. Let's quickly read it. Do I have a volunteer?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set, and Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nisi. He said, "It means hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages."
Okay, so that is our text in Exodus, in this week's parashah. Any comments, any questions before we take a closer look at it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really bothers me that it had to become a theatrical thing. Why couldn't God just have let them win without this, thing with Moses raising his hand and keeping it up? I mean, was it to show the power of Moses, or was it to show the power of God?
Well, that's what we'll see. We'll
Yeah,
talk about
okay.
that, at least in terms of some of the commentaries, but that's definitely a good question. I mean, although at a certain point, everything is theatrical.
Yeah.
I'd mentioned this line before when we were studying Parashat Noach, that in the musical 2x2, which is a very funny musical about Noach, his children are arguing with him that we've got to put a rudder on the ark. And Noach is saying, why? And finally makes the argument, but why? God promised us that we would survive. So why do we need a rudder? And his kids answer, well, I don't know, Papa. Why do we need a boat? So, sometimes like, yeah, why doesn't God just do it?
Yeah.
In the same thing, you can ask that about the whole Exodus story. Why doesn't God just redeem Israel, bring them out of Egypt? But it's talk about theatrics. That's very, very powerful. Now, of course, part of the message is God's power, learning God's power. God's power is beyond that of any earthly power, and that even a mighty nation such as Egypt is really under the thumb of Hashem. God is the God of history. So, clearly it's also a very powerful message, but, plenty of times you can say, and why did we go through all of that? Yeah.
So we can make movies.
Right. Where would Cecil B. DeMille be without?
Where would he be without the story?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds stupid, but
Yeah.
I
Yehudi?
don't know.
Well, two things. One is the ark most definitely did not have a rudder. That was the whole point. The ark basically had no way of steering. It was entirely at the mercy of Hashem. That's a very central, part of that entire story. Okay. Secondly, I mean, it sort of makes me laugh when someone asks a question, why does this have to be so theatrical? After the crossing of the Red Sea, this is a footnote.
Yeah.
Rabbi, is this the first time we see the character, well, the fellow Hur, H-U-R?
Yeah,
No,
who is he?
he is in the genealogy. Why am I suddenly blanking on?
I looked it up in online. I was just curious.
Yeah.
This is the first time he's mentioned.
Oh, okay, he wasn't in the genealogy earlier?
Oh,
No,
because that genealogy doesn't give you Shevet Yehuda. It
Right.
stops at Shevet
That's
Levi.
true. That's true.
So
It's just
therefore,
Shevet Levi.
This is the first time we've met him, but here's a very good example of how Tanakh has this way of introducing people into a story as if they're well known when we've heard nothing about them up to now. This is a standard biblical technique. Somebody's brought in what appears to us from left field, But the answer is that to the readers of the Bible, these people were familiar because the Bible wasn't their only source of tradition. That's our only source until, recently we've gotten archaeological sources, lots of other stuff. But, at the time, people knew who Torah was, even though the Tanakh doesn't bother to tell you too much about it. We find out that Bezalel is a grandson of his. Again, it may not be the same person, the old joke, who wrote the Torah? It wasn't really Moses. It was somebody else by the same name.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, according to the unquestionably Wikipedia, there is 3 separate men named Her in the Bible, and this one is the one is just he's from the tribe of Judah, and it talks about Aaron and Her holding up the arms of Moses in the battle. So, but there were there's 2 other men.
Wikipedia is assuming that
Yes.
this Hur is the one who's mentioned later on in Parshat Ki Tisa as someone from Judah. But that's an assumption. Like I said, that was my whole point to the story about Moses who wrote the Torah. It was that because 2 people have the same name don't mean that they're the same person. Are you the only Shelley around? You're not a person named Sheldon?
Yeah, I agree. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
I'm the only Yehudi Feldman in the whole United States of America. That's a pretty unique situation.
There's a couple of other.
If they Googled, nobody else has the same first and last name as I do in the whole US of A. Okay, but is that a common situation? No, that's an extremely rare situation. Okay.
Okay, I'll just throw out one other thing because I'd like to move on, and that is Hur from the tribe of Judah would certainly represent Judah and the kingly side, and Aharon is the priestly side. And I wonder if that's something that's behind this a little bit, because there's always a little bit of the jockeying, certainly in the Torah, who is the most important? Certainly in the patriarchs, Yaakov really stands out. And certainly his sons do, but it's not going to be Ruvain, his firstborn, who is going to end up with the kingship. That's Yehuda. So, that kind of jockeying back and forth and having to show both sides to some extent. We had that in the famous Haftarah for Bahalotcha, also for Hanukkah, with the 2 olive trees, which are likely representing Yehoshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the political leader. Any other comments on this story? But thank you. The genealogical stuff is much more interesting than we sometimes think in the Bible. Okay, so commentators bring out a couple of things that we're not going to get into today. I'm sorry, but just to put them in your mind, you can research them on your own. The whole question is, why is Yehoshua singled out? Why does he speak to Yehoshua? Inscribe this in a document as a reminder. And also, what does it mean? It says, Ktov zot zikaron b'sefer. Inscribe this in a document as a reminder. Sorry, read it aloud. It's not Joshua writes it down, he hears it. And then what do they mean by a document? The commentators discuss that could be a separate book, like the other books that are mentioned in the Torah, Sefer Milchamot Hashem, Sefer Yashar, or it could be, they also say, it's the pshat is, he said, write it down on something.
By the way, here's another example of someone who's being introduced for the first time without any explanation as to why he's being introduced, and that's Joshua himself. He's never been mentioned before. Okay, now out of nowhere, we're being told that when we need an army Joshua was the person who's picked to lead the army. This is before we even know that Joshua is Moshe's, adjunct, or attendant, or whatever. In other words, this might be a sneak preview of going to Eretz Yisrael, because Joshua was being introduced as a general. Moshe is being told something that he has to make sure Yehoshua memorizes. Okay, I mean, after all, Rashi writes here, this is a hint to Moses that he's not going to make it to Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
Because otherwise, why is he making Yehoshua memorize this? But my real point here is, we don't know who Yehoshua is. We don't know who Hur is. The only one we know who he is Aaron. The others, there was two characters are being introduced here that we've never heard before.
13.
Yeah. Okay, back to taking a look at the defeat of Amalek. Carrie raised a good question. Why this whole thing with the raising of the hands and stuff? So, the question is, how did we defeat Amalek? What is the purpose of the raising of the hands? And let's take a look at a couple of the Aramaic translations and see what they add, or see if there's something different than the biblical text. Maddie, do you want to continue with you can read it in the English
Thanks.
instead of the Aramaic.
I wouldn't be reading it in the Aramaic. And it was when Moshe lifted up his hands in prayer that the house of Israel prevailed. And when he rested his hand from praying, that the house of Amalek prevailed.
Okay, so that's very similar to our text, although we'll talk in a moment. And what I really wanted to say, very similar in Targum Yerushalmi, this other Aramaic translation. Read this one too, please.
And it was that when Moshe lifted up his hands in prayer, the house of Israel prevailed. And when his hands declined from prayer, Amalek prevailed, and Israel fell in the line of battle.
Yeah. So, what is the one thing that both of these verses add?
Did prayer.
Exactly. In the Aramaic, Kazakef Moshe Yadoi Betsiloi, when he raised his hands in prayer. And we're going to see, why do they add that? What is their concern? Of course, it's initially trying to explain why he's raising his hands. He's raising his hands in prayer. But now we'll take a look, and I think we've looked at this in the past. A very famous midrash from Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, who, we looked at his text last week as well. Basically, there are two rabbinic texts that convey the same midrash. But here's the one in the Mechilta. Do you want to continue, Maddie?
Yep. And it was when Moses lifted his hand that Israel prevailed, etc. Now, do the hands of Moses strengthen Israel or break Amalek? Rather, whenever Moses lifted his hand heavenward, they gazed at it and affirmed their faith in him, who commanded Moses to do thus. And the Blessed Holy One wrought for them miracles and mighty acts.
Okay, can you guess from this, what is their issue? What are they having problems with?
Problem is that they don't want this to look like some kind of magical act. They want this to look like, because then it looks like Moses is doing it. Okay, the idea is, it's clear that from the way this way is being presented, that that all Moses is doing is praying to Hashem. By the way, the source you're quoting, the Mechilta, does not tell it exactly the way the Mishnah does.
Right, we'll get to the Mishnah in a moment.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure we got that. Okay.
But they give another case where they're concerned about this.
Similarly, make for yourself a saraf, a fiery serpent.
Yeah, I remember that story where God is angry with Israel and he sends these fiery serpents to bite the heels of the Israelites. And Moshe is commanded to put up a bronze serpent on a staff, and everybody looks at it and will be healed. I mean, I don't know, somebody's got some stuff in the background. If you could just mute yourself if you're not talking.
I think it's Susie.
Susie? Okay, thank
Should I-
you. You
Now
just mute.
She's not there.
I'm here now.
Okay, if you could just mute. Okay, thank you. So it seems a little unusual that, you know, you look at a snake in a pole and that's going to heal you. Of course, that we would know as I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. You'll correct me. Caduceus, the medical symbol.
Caduceus, yes, you are pronouncing it correctly.
Okay. So, and then they ask similar question. Okay, go ahead, Maddie.
Now does a snake put to death or bring to life? Rather, whenever he did so, Israel would gaze at it and affirm their faith in him who commanded Moses to do thus. And the Blessed Holy One wrought healings for them.
Yeah, and not only does, and here the Mechilta brings in something else that the Mishnah doesn't bring.
Similarly, and the blood shall be for you as a sign.
Yeah, that's of course in the Pesach. They put the blood on the mashkof and the mezuzah, on the lintel and the doorposts.
Now, how can the blood affect an angel or Israel? Rather, when Israel did this and placed the blood on their doors, the Blessed Holy One pitied them, and the Lord shall skip over the door.
Yeah, so I don't think that's quite as good an example as the others. But, you know, it's the sense they don't want this sense of the magical in there. And of course, we also have in the biblical text, Moshe takes the rod in his hand. That rod is a little bit of a magical wand. They do a lot of wonders with it. Of course, it's not really a magical wand. It's just kind of directs Moshe's power, which in fact comes from God. And here's the source that Yudi was mentioning, very famous text from the Mishnah. Again, we just quickly, would someone like to read? Anyone else?
I can read.
Okay, thanks, Ricky.
And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. Exodus 17:11. Did the hands of Moses make war break war?
That should be or break war. I'm sorry, I cut it off too
It's
soon.
okay. Rather, the verse teaches you that as long as the Israelites look upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. But if not, they fell.
Yeah, and then the second part, just like the Mechilta.
Similarly, you can say the verse states, make for yourself a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. Did the serpent kill or did the serpent preserve life? Rather, when the Israelites looked upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed, but if not, they rotted.
I'm not sure that's the best translation, but you know, it's the idea. Now, of course, we read the Bible and we'd be concerned about magic. You know, we don't want these things to be seen as magical. And the early church had kind of the same problem. And they, of course, also, you know, they're reading what they call the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. Now, that's one thing that should a little bit be corrected when we talk about the Jews and the Christians share the same Bible. Yes and no. We have Tanakh. They have the Old Testament and the New Testament. They arrange the texts in the Old Testament differently than we do in Tanakh, although there are different arrangements in Jewish tradition as well. But, you know, everything, they end up reading the text in light of what comes after it. And of course, even for the Old Testament text, they were using not necessarily the Hebrew text that we use, but the Septuagint. Anyway, here's how we see one of the early church fathers dealing with this text. You want to go on, Ricky? Mm-hmm.
But to come now to Moses, why, I wonder, did he merely at the time when Joshua was battling against Amalek pray sitting with hands expanded, when in circumstances so critical, he ought rather surely to have commenced his prayer by knees bended and hands beating his breast and a face prostrate on the ground, except it was that there, where the name of the Lord Jesus was the theme of speech, destined
What?
he was
Yeah.
to enter the
Again, they're reading it a little bit differently than, we added the element of prayer in our Targumim, but again, they're reading this text from their perspective. And, again, we'll think, what are they doing with this text? Go ahead.
except it was that there, where the name of the Lord Jesus was the theme of speech, destined as he was to enter the lists one day singly against the devil, the figure of the cross was also necessary, that figure through which Jesus was to win the victory.
Okay,
Why
so again, what does Moses look like as he's sitting on the rock with his arms raised?
Like Jesus.
Like crucify Jesus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Not like
there we
Jesus,
go.
like
So,
crucify Jesus.
yeah, so for like, oh, look at this text. It's obviously talking about Jesus. Go on.
Why again did the same Moses, after the prohibition of any likeness of anything, set forth a brazen serpent placed on a tree in a hanging posture for a spectacle of healing to Israel at the time when, after their idolatry, they were suffering extermination by serpents, except that in this case he was exhibiting the Lord's cross, on which the serpent, the devil, was made a show of, and for everyone hurt by such snakes, that is his angels, on turning intently from the peccancy.
Yeah, I forgot to look that word up. I had never ever seen it before.
The stain, the bad,
Stain, okay.
bad smell, the blame it brings on the person, and all those three put together.
Right. Mhm,
From the
okay.
peccancy of sins to the sacraments of Christ's cross, salvation was outwrought. For he who then gazed upon that cross was freed from the bite of the serpents.
Oh, God.
Yeah,
Hmm,
so,
coolest name.
it's just kind of, it's interesting that to some extent they're offering, and who knows, maybe he knew the rabbinic traditions that, it's not really the magic of Moshe's hands, but, it's the image of prayer. But, for the Christians, if first of all, if there are three, it's often the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And, if it's somebody up like this or somebody hanging on a pole, that obviously has got to be a reference. Here we have a very similar thing. And just want, because I don't want to spend that much time on this. And in the Apocalypse, you see where I'm reading?
Mhm.
Yes.
Same exhortation of divine preaching speaks, saying, hold fast that which thou hast, lest another take thy crown. Which example of perseverance and persistence is pointed out in Exodus, when Moses, for the overthrow of Amalek, who bore the type of the devil, raised up his open hands in the sign and sacrament of the cross, and could not conquer his adversary unless he had steadfastly preserved in the
Persevered.
sign with the hands lifted up. Similar type of comment. Yes, Yehudi?
Well, I think in view of what you're presenting here, I'd like to modify what I said before. I just assumed, the traditional modern Jewish scholarship interpretation. But it's very possible that the Tannaitic sources are responding to the Christian interpretation. In other words, they're trying to say This isn't the only place. Look at the story about how Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov kept all the mitzvot to the Torah down to the last detail. Obviously, this is a response to Paul's claim in Epistle to the Hebrews that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov show me you don't need mitzvot because they were the most highly spiritual people who ever lived, and they didn't have any mitzvot at all. In other words, the Haggadah is full of stuff that's responding to Christianity. Larry Howard pointed that out. So, I wasn't aware of what you're putting up here. Given now that you're putting that up, I would think that's the second possibility of what's bothering them.
Yeah, I always thought of it.
Gestures of both. What do they have in common when you really got? By the way, in the Mechilta, they give you a third one, the blood of the Pesach. Okay, but isn't it interesting? All three of those could easily be taken as Christ-like images.
Oh, and the Christians most certainly do that with the Pesach.
Right. So my point is maybe what the
Lamb.
Right. So maybe what the Mechilta is trying to do, and the Mishnah only picks two of the three, but either way, what they all have in common is the fact that basically they could be interpreted as Christ-like crucifixion type images. And it's very possible that the Tanaim are trying to respond to that take on it, and that, or I said before, that they're trying to get out from under what seems like a magical take on it.
Yeah, that's.
I'm finding what you're presenting today very stimulating, interesting, and in view of what you're saying, I might want to revise what I said before.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, because I learned about this stuff in rabbinical school, but we didn't really look at the texts in the church fathers. And I think we were thinking of it mostly as,
the fact that I went to YU, I think it's even less likely that I looked at them.
But then I always thought of it, yes, this is something they're taking from Jewish tradition or they're sharing with Jewish tradition. But you're right, given the timing of the Mechilta, certainly, and even the Mishnah, what are the ideas that they're thinking about in terms of Jesus, so that it's, it could work the other way, that really it's a response, particularly already by the time of the Mechilta, they're talking about Jesus as the Paschal Lamb. Yeah. So now let's take a look at, go on a little bit, at who was or is Amalek. We're not really going to exhaust this, but just raise a couple of ideas that we know from later Jewish tradition. But just, to see that kind of early on, it's commentators pick up on it. So first of all, just Ibn Ezra. Commenting on the line, Ki machol emche et zecher Amalek, I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Okay, would somebody else like to go on here?
I'll read.
This is a different topic. Okay.
I'll read.
Okay, thank you.
The reason I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, because Amalek angered God. For the chiefs of Edom, and similarly those of Moab and the Philistia feared and trembled before God because of the signs which the Lord displayed in Egypt and at the sea. Now this very Amalek heard the might that God displayed on behalf of his people Israel. Behold, he came from a distant place to wage war against Israel. He did not fear God. Indeed, Scripture explicitly states, and he, Amalek, feared not God.
Okay, so what is Amalek's great sin?
He didn't fear God.
He didn't fear God.
That's it.
Now, it should also be pointed out that the term fear of God is often used in a context where it implies that someone who doesn't fear God doesn't have a sense of morality. That's not necessarily what the phrase means, but it's often used in that context. So, here's Amalek. He's, first of all, his hubris. He just doesn't, he didn't fear God, couldn't care less about God. Now, of course, what we get from the story in Deuteronomy is he's attacking the weak and the disabled and the young, that there's a certain viciousness to his attack, and that clearly this guy has no sense of morality. But let's also read this one other comment.
Some say that Amalek was the name of a king. They say this because scripture reads Amalek and his people. Perhaps another nation joined Amalek.
Yeah, so here we're moving from Amalek as someone more specific, not the whole nation, but really the king. And also at the same time, suggesting that maybe it's more than just Amalek. And in fact, there's a lot of good reason to think that, because Amalek actually appears in many places in the Tanakh. And I have here different places in the Tanakh. First of all, Bilam, in his prophecies, he saw Amalek, and taking up his theme, he said, "A leading nation is Amalek, but its fate is to perish forever." Okay. But then when we, supposedly Yoshua defeats Amalek, but as we move into the period of the Judges, we've got Amalek in a number of places. So, but interestingly, Eglon, who's the king of Moab, brings the Ammonites and the Amalekites together to fight against Israel. Interestingly, in tomorrow's Haftarah, Shirat Devorah, when Ephraim came, they whose roots are in Amalek. After you, your kin Benjamin. From Machir came down leaders from Zvulun, such as hold the martial staff. So all these people are joining with Devorah and Barak. And it's just kind of odd that, from Ephraim came those whose roots are in Amalek. Here they seem to be fighting with the Israelites. Then we have another context here where the Amalek is one of the tribes that attacks Israel, moving in with all of their flocks and eating all the pasture land. Then, of course, the famous story of Amalek, that is the Haftarah for Parashat Zachor, where Shaul is commanded to kill them. But even when Shaul only seems to keep King Agag and the flocks and stuff, we have the Amalekites, an enemy to David. David has to come up and fight against them. And here we see a couple examples of that. And really, it's not until days of King Hezekiah of Judah that some of the tribes attack and wipe out the Amalekites. So, it's an interesting thing to think about the Amalekites. Now let's just, take a look at what Sarna has to say. Somebody like to read, or Susie, go ahead, sorry.
A somewhat more expansive account of this incident is given in Deuteronomy 25:17-19, which reports that the Amalekites made a surprise rear attack on the famished and exhausted Israelites not long after the escape from Egypt. They ruthlessly cut down the stragglers, the elderly, the weak, and the infirm. Israel was forced to fight its first defensive war for survival. Who are the Amalekites? The name itself is non-Semitic. Its origin is obscure. We first encounter Amalek as the 13th descendant of Esau Edom in the list in Genesis 36. He was born of Timnah, a concubine of Esau's firstborn son, Eliphaz. She is said to have been a Horite, which means that she belonged to the people who were indigenous to Mount Seir. The Edomites displaced them and largely wiped them out. Translating the genealogical shorthand of Genesis 36 into terms of historical reality, we may reconstruct the following situation. The tribe of Amalek has been a late and subordinate adherent to the 12-tribe Edomite Confederation. Forced out of its inhabitant, it pursued a nomadic existence in the Negev and Sinai Peninsula. The Amalekites interpreted the sudden appearance of the Israelites in this region as a menacing encroachment upon their territory and as a threat to their control of the oasis and trading routes. The Amalekites therefore savagely attacked the Israelites. This episode, like the preceding one, occurred in Rephidim. Apart from the locale, the two narratives also share in common certain other features. The rod, verses 5 and 9, the similar sounding Hebrew stems nun,
Vav.
Shin,
Sin.
or sin,
Sin.
nun, sin, hey, and nun,
Oh,
sin,
right.
sin. What?
It's nun vav samach, not nun vav sin.
Oh, it is a
okay.
samach.
Verses 2, 7, and 15. And the demonstration of God's protective and supporting presence in times of adversity.
Yeah, so that explains why the two incidents are connected in the biblical text. It also shows that Amalek is, kind of unconnected because they do appear in some different different geographical places, and as Sarna suggests, I am not up on the latest in geography and scholarly theories on these different tribes, but clearly they seem to be kind of a wandering tribe. And Ibn Ezra's comment that other people joined with Amalek is certainly possible here. In fact, we have Amalek joining with other tribes. So Amalek is kind of this amorphous being to some extent. Actually, one contemporary commentator, Rabbi Moshe Liebtag, I think.
Yeah, Liebtag, Menachem Liebtag, not
Yeah,
Moshe.
Menachem
Liebtag.
Yeah, I have a number of his study sheets buried in my files, because I guess he was at the Garment Street Shul, the Garment.
He spoke at some of these places, but he's on the circuit. He's one of the 4 people I told you about who revolutionized the entire study of Tanakh in the Israel modern Orthodox community.
Okay, because my one of my cousins would send me papers from his shul, and there are some really interesting things in there. So anyway, he had commented on the fact that Amalek does appear all over the biblical text, and that there's no mention of Amalek's God. There's not really a clear sense of where Amalek is from. And so he's already implying that when we think about Amalek, even in the biblical text, that it's almost already taking on this generic meaning of enemy, not just, the specific enemy of Amalek, but an ongoing enemy of Israel. And here is Sarna's later commentary. Keep going, Susie.
Throughout the ages, Hebrew.
That's the Hebrew. Kiyad al-Kesiyah, because Amalek's hand will be against God's throne. Midor dor, from generation to generation.
Is unparalleled and is probably a poetic form of the verse from generation to generation found in Isaiah 34:10. In Ugaritic text 19.
That's door, or dar. I don't know how it's pronounced in Ugaritic. You can check with your son on that.
Yeah, really. Means eternity and is used in parallelism with lilam, forever.
That means le'olam.
We had it in Sefer Shmot already. Zeshemili Olam v'zezikri l'dor.
Yeah.
I don't see an O there. Leolam.
We're assuming a vav.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Well, also the apostrophe here,
Mhm.
that often indicates a guttural, like an ayin. Because remember, we don't pronounce an ayin, but
Right.
Jews from the Arab countries do. The ayin is a pronounced letter.
Guttural.
Guttural. You know, basically you
It-
swallow gum when you read it, and you get the.
There's something else also, Rabbi Popky. Sean is making an assumption here, which is the part where he says that somehow or other Amalek got pushed out because they were just a junior tribe and didn't.
Yeah.
You know, you don't really get that impression when you read the story of Amalek and Chor in chapter 36. There's an Aleph Amalek. So I think we have to say what you said before. The tradition about Amalek is amorphous, which means that they're different traditions. In other words, there's more than one tradition about them. There's one tradition that makes them part of the Edomite Confederation. And there's another tradition that doesn't emphasize the Edomite origin, but rather they seem to be hanging out more with the Midianites. And there's still another tradition that hangs them out with the Canaanim. And then we have, you know, the whole bit with Haman HaGagi. So I think basically it's correct to say it's how you presented it. It's quite amorphous. And we should assume that when this term is used, it definitely originally meant the specific people, but I think it's quite correct to say that, you know, by the time you get to the end of the Tanakh, it's become a generic enemy.
Yeah. That's why, you know, sometimes I read Dr. Sarna and, you know, I have a sense, yes, I'm not sure if that's the consensus today. I mean, you know, he passed away already a number of years ago, and, you know, he is from, you know, very much influenced by Albright and
Cassuto
and who
and H.L.
Yeah, H.L. Ginsburg, and as well the guy who did all the Ugaritic stuff. But you know, it was an earlier biblical scholarship. I mean, it was brilliant, and you know, having had both the pleasure and the privilege of studying with him, you know, in class there, he made some really remarkable statements, you know, that I was very conservative in his writing. But, you know, we're all products of our background and our training. And, you know, scholarship marches on even for the greatest of the scholars. You know, my teacher, Alav Shalom, Baruch Boxer, who wrote the fabulous book on the origin of the Seder, he automatically assumed that the Tosefta was later than the Mishnah in talking about
now
the
we know
Pesach. And now, you know, as you pointed out, because you read the article before it was published, Judy Hauptman clearly showed that the Tosefta text is earlier. So, you know, anyway, go on. Sorry, Susie.
The Hebrew phrase envisages a protracted cycle of wars between Israel and Amalek. Several references to those wars are recorded in the biblical narratives. In the course of the wilderness wanderings, Amalekites and Canaanites jointly inflicted a shattering blow on an Israelite force, as told in Numbers 14, 44, 45. Amalekites, either as mercenaries of neighboring kingdoms or independently, made devastating incursions into Israelite settlements through the period of the Judges. It was King Saul who first dealt effectively with the recurring Amalekite menace, and King David who finally confronted the implacable enemy on its home ground. He decisively neutralized its war-making capabilities. Still, it was not until the days of King Hezekiah that the surviving Amalekites were destroyed, according to 1 Chronicles 4:43.
Yeah, so I would say
At
that
that time, they're in the southwest,
Hmm.
near Shevet Shimon are the ones who.
right, yeah.
Right?
So
So
you
they
know,
make the rounds.
yeah, and I
Nobody
wonder,
wanted them.
there's and I couldn't find the paper. I have a paper by one of my other favorite teachers, Rabbi Reuven Kimmelman, and he talks about, like, did they really destroy Amalek? We read this and it's difficult because basically it's calling for genocide. And now, of course, within the biblical context, this is not exactly a bosom buddy of Israel. I mean, they have attacked us in terrible ways and throughout history. So there are reasons why we don't like them. But of course, because it's this kind of amorphous being, as I said, Sarna comments here at the end. Go on, Susie.
In later Jewish literature, Amalek becomes a synonym for the implacable enemies of Israel. Haman, the Agagite, was identified with Amalek. Josephus made him a descendant of Amalek. Rome, too, was given the code name Amalek.
Yeah, so I mean, this is probably what we're very familiar with, is that we often refer to implacable enemies as Amalek. Certainly you read things that people talk about the Nazis, they talk about Iran, for example. I mean, Iran is kind of a modern example of an Amalek type of kingdom, if you will. But I did come across this interesting comment by Rav Kook. Rav Kook, of course, the first chief rabbi of Israel, a tremendous mystic. This actually comes from a text that I wasn't aware of, but there are a lot of things that he wrote that I'm not aware of. It's what's the name of it again? Asiya Aya, which is a commentary that he wrote over a number of years on Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is a Guttic abstract of the Talmud. It basically takes out all of the Guttic sections of the Talmud and gathers them together. It was traditionally studied on Shabbat afternoon. So this was his commentary on that text. So would somebody else like to go on? I want to spread around the wealth. Anyone want to read?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Rav
you, Carol.
Kook, under there.
Yeah.
Moses of blessed memory could not wage war with Amalek himself. Amalek is the antagonist of Israel and their opponent. The eye that sees until the end of time sees that even Amalek has a purpose. For as long as Israel is not completely purified, a force to oppose them is needed. That's how we got there. There, the hands of Moses were heavy. But Aaron and Hur, who had the appropriate outlook of the generation and the hour, were able to overcome this by supporting his hands. This was achieved by Moses humbling himself, according to the need of the hour, to damage but not completely demolish Amalek. Thus, even Joshua was only able to weaken rather than destroy Amalek. Thus, the stone that Moses sat on is an eternal reminder of God's chesed, that he allowed our enemy to be weakened in our hour of need, even though in the eternal plan, Amalek will still exist.
So this is interesting. Obviously, this is not any kind of pshat reading. It's a very spiritualized reading. And he is kind of well, first of all, how does he understand Amalek? What is the purpose of Amalek?
They keep us on our toes.
Yeah, basically. It's a very interesting reading. And we always think of Amalek as the implacable enemy. And here he's saying, Yeah, but this is the one that keeps us on our toes. That he is part of the purification process of Israel, which, one could agree or disagree with that theology. I think there are a lot of questions that can be raised, but it's still an interesting perspective. But the sense that Amalek exists not only as a physical enemy, but within our own spiritual challenges. And in other places, and students of Rav Kook apparently do a little bit more with the notion of compassion, because clearly they're disturbed by the notion of wiping out Amalek. Certainly, it's a struggle in contemporary Israel, struggle in Israeli thought. How do we understand the Palestinians? Now, on one hand, it's pretty clear they're an Amalek type of character. In certainly the leadership of the Palestinians has continually failed to accept the existence of Israel, or tolerate the existence of Jews. And we know, I mean, I don't have to say anymore. We know who the Palestinians represent. From the other side, of course, there are those who take the mitzvah of wiping out Amalek very, very seriously. And the question is, what do we do in the 21st century? On one hand, we have to combat our enemies. We can't just sit back and let somebody wipe us out. On the other hand, what are our obligations for peace? And these are the types of struggles that Israel deals with on a regular basis, and much more than some in the press would make it out to be. But it's just interesting that, as we think about Amalek, it's an ongoing tension. What do we do with our enemies? Do we continue this spiritualization, if you will, of Amalek? But what happens in the here and now, in the practical? How do we respond? So it's just something for thought. Clear
Good
answer.
topic for another discussion at some future date.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I didn't mean it as no, I just wanted to throw there, this is tough. So,
By the way, I found the paper by Kimmelman. It's in your inbox.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's probably my file somewhere too.
I'm assuming that's the one. You'll tell me when you read it.
All right. Yeah. So I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
And a reminder that services are completely online tonight at 6:30, tomorrow at 10, and we'll have again a Torah discussion, which has been really so wonderful. I keep saying this as the person who despises Zoom services, I really appreciated the discussion and everybody's comments. And I obviously appreciate this one too. I don't want to imply this. Then Havdalah at 6. And then we have a Zoom minion at Monday and on Sunday and Monday. Howard Sislin lost, and Michelle, his sister, lost their uncle, Charles Sislin. And the burial is Sunday in Long Island. And I think we sent out the Zoom information. But even though there's no one who has an obligation to say Kaddish, they really want, an opportunity to do something for their uncle. And also people be able to stay on and talk with them after the minyan. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Everybody doing well otherwise? Susie, how's Mitch?
He's pretty good.
Good.
He had the cast removed and he's in a boot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Good.
That's
I don't know
very
if that
cool.
makes it much easier, but it's progress. So that's good to hear.
Yes. And the doctor said he was very pleased with how Mitch was doing.
Oh, that's good. Then I imagine we're all pleased too.
Yes.
So
Okay,
again,
thank you.
have a good day. Shabbat shalom.
Yasher koach.
Yeah.
Bruchim to you.